By the summer of 1944, Germany's war in the East was already lost in principle, but not yet in structure. Large German forces still occupied vast territory. Front lines still existed. Command hierarchies still functioned. To an outside observer, the Eastern Front looked battered but intact. In reality, it was hollow. What remained was not a resilient defensive system, but a fragile shell held together by inertia, wishful thinking, and catastrophic misjudgment. The central problem was strategic distortion. German high command no longer assessed the Eastern Front as a single interconnected system. Instead, it treated each sector as an isolated problem. The South, with its oil fields and Romanian allies, was prioritized. The North, guarding the Baltic, was politically sensitive. The center, Belarus, was misjudged as quiet, exhausted, and unsuitable for major Soviet operations. That assumption would prove fatal. Army Group Center held the Belarusian sector. On paper, it was one of the strongest German formations still in existence, with several field armies deployed along a wide front. In reality, it was overextended, under-resourced, and structurally brittle. Its divisions were spread thin across forests, marshes, and poor road networks. Defensive depth was minimal. Mobile reserves were almost non-existent. What strength remained was static, tied to fixed positions that assumed the enemy would attack conventionally, if at all. German intelligence reinforced this false sense of security. Soviet deception operations were extensive and effective. Radio traffic, troop movements, and logistical preparations all suggested that the Red Army's next major blow would fall in the south, possibly toward Romania or Hungary. German command accepted this narrative eagerly because it aligned with their own fears and priorities. Reinforcements were shifted away from the central sector. Armored reserves were pulled south. Belarus was left to hold with what it had. What it had was not enough. The Red Army, by mid-1944, was no longer learning how to conduct large-scale operations. It had mastered them. Years of brutal attrition had forged command structures capable of coordinating multiple fronts, massing artillery, managing logistics, and exploiting breakthroughs with speed and discipline. Crucially, Soviet planning now emphasized systemic destruction rather than territorial gain. The goal was not to push the Germans back, it was to dismantle their ability to function as an army. This is where the strategic imbalance became decisive. Germany could no longer replace losses at scale. Divisions destroyed were gone permanently. Vehicles lost could not be rebuilt fast enough. Trained officers killed were irreplaceable. The Soviet Union, by contrast, had reached a point where losses, while still severe, could be absorbed without halting operations. This asymmetry defined everything that followed. Belarus was selected precisely because of this imbalance. Army Group Center formed a structural hinge in the German Eastern Front. If it collapsed, the northern and southern sectors would be destabilized automatically. Supply routes would be severed. Command coordination would fracture. The entire front would unravel not gradually, but catastrophically. German commanders in the sector understood some of these risks, but lacked the authority and resources to correct them. Requests for reinforcements were denied. Proposals for elastic defense were rejected. Hitler's standing orders forbade large withdrawals and emphasized holding ground at all costs. This transformed fixed defensive lines into liabilities. Positions that might have been abandoned to preserve combat power instead became traps. Terrain compounded the danger. Belarus was dominated by forests, swamps, and limited road networks. Movement was constrained. Retreat routes were predictable. Bridges were few. In such terrain, once encirclement began, escape would be extremely difficult. The Red Army understood this well. German planners did not fully account for it. Logistics further weakened the German position. Supply lines ran westward through limited rail and road corridors. Fuel shortages restricted mobility. Ammunition stocks were uneven. Artillery support was rationed. Army Group Center was defending a vast front with insufficient depth and declining sustainment. It could hold positions, but it could not maneuver effectively once those positions were breached. The most dangerous illusion was stability. For months, the front in Belarus had been relatively static. This bred complacency. Units rotated. Defensive routines became habitual. Commanders focused on holding sectors rather than preparing for sudden collapse. When the offensive came, it would not strike an alert, mobile defense. It would strike an army psychologically conditioned to quiet. Meanwhile, Soviet forces prepared with methodical patience. Multiple fronts were allocated overwhelming manpower and artillery. Logistics were staged forward, bridges were reinforced, roads were improved. Artillery ammunition was stockpiled in quantities Germany could no longer match. This preparation was not hurried, it was deliberate. The objective was certainty, not speed. The timing was chosen carefully. June 1944 coincided with Allied landings in Normandy, further stretching German command attention and reserves. Germany now faced crises on multiple fronts simultaneously. There would be no strategic flexibility, no ability to shift forces once the blow fell. Operation Bagration was therefore not conceived as a battle in the traditional sense. It was conceived as a demolition. The aim was to destroy Army Group Center so completely that it could not be reconstituted, not pushed back, not delayed, erased. Germany entered the summer of 1944 believing it still possessed an Eastern Front. What it actually possessed was a collection of isolated formations bound to a system already beyond recovery. When the Soviet offensive began, it would not test German strength. It would expose German emptiness. The collapse that followed would not be gradual. It would be rapid, structural, and irreversible. The plan behind Operation Bagration was not bold improvisation. It was engineered inevitability. Soviet planners did not seek a breakthrough at a single point followed by exploitation. They designed a synchronized collapse. Multiple blows, delivered almost simultaneously, calibrated to overload German command, logistics, and maneuver at every level. At the highest level, the operation committed 4 Soviet fronts along a broad axis facing Army Group Center. Each front had a defined role, but none acted in isolation. The intent was to deny Germany the ability to identify a main effort. Wherever German commanders looked, they would see crisis. Wherever they reacted, they would be too late elsewhere. This represented a mature evolution in Soviet operational art. Earlier offensives often relied on sheer mass at a narrow sector. Bagration inverted that logic. It spread pressure across a wide frontage while concentrating decisive force at selected nodes, river crossings, road hubs, and army boundaries. These were not random targets. They were the joints that held the German system together. Deception was integral, not auxiliary. Soviet Maskirovka efforts convinced German intelligence that the main summer offensive would strike in the south. Radio traffic was manipulated. Dummy formations were displayed. Logistics were staged in ways that appeared defensive or routine. Meanwhile, the real buildup in Belarus was concealed by terrain, night movement, and disciplined communications. When the attack came, it achieved not just surprise, but misorientation. German commanders misread its scale even as it unfolded. The operational design emphasized sequencing. The opening phase targeted German forward defenses with overwhelming artillery. This was not preparatory fire in the old sense. It was annihilative. Batteries were assigned specific objectives: trenches, command posts, communications lines, and known artillery positions. Fire plans were dense and sustained, designed to paralyze response rather than simply soften resistance. Immediately behind this fire, infantry assaults were launched with clear, limited objectives. The goal was not to seize territory quickly, but to rupture cohesion. Once initial lines were breached, armored and mechanized formations moved through prepared corridors to strike operational depth. Crucially, these exploitation forces were not committed prematurely. They were held until breaches were verified and resistance degraded. One of the most important aspects of the plan was its treatment of German reserves. Soviet intelligence accurately assessed that Army Group Center had little mobile depth. Rather than forcing the Germans to commit reserves piecemeal, Bagration aimed to eliminate the need for reserves by destroying command and communications early. When German headquarters lost contact with subordinate units, coordination collapsed. Orders became obsolete before they were received. Encirclement was not a byproduct, it was the objective. Soviet spearheads aimed to meet behind German positions, sealing pockets quickly and moving on rather than grinding them down immediately. This created a cascading effect. Units trapped in pockets were rendered operationally irrelevant even before they were destroyed. German command faced the impossible choice of attempting relief with non-existent reserves or abandoning entire formations. Logistics was treated as a primary target. Rail lines feeding Army Group Center were interdicted. Road junctions were seized or cratered. Bridges were taken intact when possible, destroyed when not. Fuel depots and supply columns were struck by air and artillery. This ensured that even units not immediately engaged would soon be immobilized. A defending army without fuel or ammunition ceases to be an army in a modern war. Timing amplified these effects. The offensive began with near-simultaneous assaults across multiple sectors. This prevented German commanders from establishing a clear priority. Even accurate local reporting could not be synthesized into a coherent picture. The fog of war was not accidental. It was manufactured. Soviet air power played a supporting but critical role. It was not tasked with achieving air superiority everywhere. Instead, it focused on interdiction, isolating battlefields, striking retreat routes, and disrupting movement. German attempts to withdraw or reposition were detected and punished. Daylight movement became hazardous, further compressing German decision-making windows. Perhaps most decisive was the Soviet understanding of tempo. The plan did not allow pauses that would enable German stabilization. Each phase flowed into the next. As soon as a pocket formed, exploitation forces bypassed it. As soon as a river line was reached, bridging units moved forward under protection. Momentum was preserved not by recklessness, but by preparation. Every anticipated obstacle had a designated solution. German doctrine, by contrast, was rigid. Standing orders emphasized holding ground and forbade large withdrawals without approval. In a fast-moving, multi-axis offensive, this rigidity became lethal. Units that might have disengaged early to form a new line instead waited for orders that never came or arrived too late. What Soviet planners called time compression crushed German decision cycles. The plan's brilliance lay in its cruelty to systems rather than soldiers. Individual German units often fought competently, sometimes stubbornly. But competence at the tactical level could not compensate for systemic paralysis. When headquarters were destroyed, when supply columns were cut, when flanks vanished, bravery became irrelevant. Operation Bagration was designed to answer a single question: what happens when an army with no depth, no mobility, and no strategic flexibility is struck everywhere at once? The answer was not a retreat, it was erasure. When the opening blows landed, the plan worked exactly as intended. German defenses cracked not because they were weak in isolation, but because they were strong only in isolation. Once the connections between them were severed, Army Group Center ceased to function as a coherent force. The shape of destruction was now set. What followed would unfold with terrifying speed. When the offensive opened in late June 1944, it did not announce itself with ambiguity. The first Soviet blows landed with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. This was not a probing attack, and it was not limited in scope. From the opening hours, Operation Bagration revealed itself as a coordinated attempt to shatter the German front in its entirety. The initial artillery preparation was overwhelming in both density and precision. German forward positions were not merely shelled, they were systematically dismantled. Communications lines were cut early. Known artillery positions were targeted with counter-battery fire. Command posts were hit repeatedly. German units that survived the bombardment found themselves isolated, often without orders, unaware of what was happening beyond their immediate surroundings. This was not incidental damage. It was deliberate dislocation. Soviet infantry assaults followed closely behind the fire. They did not rush forward recklessly. Assault units advanced with specific objectives, often bypassing pockets of resistance rather than becoming entangled in costly firefights. This was a critical departure from earlier Soviet methods. The aim was not to clear every trench. It was to rupture the continuity of the German line and open corridors for exploitation forces. German forward divisions were hit hardest. Many were already under strength, manning extended sectors with limited depth. Once their front lines were penetrated, there was little behind them. Counterattacks were attempted, but without armor, fuel, or coordinated artillery support, they achieved little. In several sectors, German regimental and divisional headquarters were overrun within hours of the initial assault. Command structures collapsed faster than formations. One of the most damaging effects was the speed at which Soviet breakthroughs reached operational depth. Armored and mechanized units surged through gaps almost as soon as they appeared. German doctrine relied on buying time, slowing advances until reserves could be committed. That logic failed immediately. There were no reserves close enough, and those that existed were already earmarked for other sectors or immobilized by fuel shortages. German commanders initially misread the situation. Reports described heavy attacks, but similar reports had preceded earlier offensives that were eventually contained. What they did not grasp was the simultaneity. Breakthroughs were occurring along multiple axes at once. There was no single Schwerpunkt to counter. Any attempt to reinforce one crisis worsened another. Within the first days, entire German corps found their flanks exposed. Boundaries between units, always vulnerable points, were exploited ruthlessly. Soviet forces drove wedges between German armies, severing lateral communication and movement. Units that attempted to realign discovered that roads were already under artillery fire or blocked by advancing Soviet troops. The terrain that had once been considered defensive now worked against the Germans. Forests and swamps limited movement to predictable routes. Once those routes were cut, retreat became chaotic. Bridges were seized or destroyed. River crossings turned into choke points where units piled up under air and artillery attack. What might have been an orderly withdrawal in open terrain became fragmentation. German air support was largely absent. The Luftwaffe, already weakened, was unable to contest Soviet air operations effectively. Soviet aircraft focused on interdiction rather than dogfighting. Retreating columns were attacked repeatedly. Supply vehicles were destroyed. Fuel shortages worsened rapidly. Mobility, already limited, collapsed further. The most revealing aspect of the opening phase was how quickly German cohesion evaporated. Units were not annihilated in place. They were disoriented, bypassed, and rendered irrelevant. A division cut off from supplies and command ceased to function as a fighting formation, even if many of its soldiers were still alive and armed. This distinction mattered. Army Group Center was not being destroyed piece by piece. It was being dismantled structurally. Encirclements formed with alarming speed. Soviet spearheads converged behind German positions, sealing pockets before commanders fully understood the threat. Relief efforts were impossible. There were no mobile forces available, and higher headquarters struggled to identify where to intervene. Hitler's insistence on holding ground compounded the disaster. Units ordered to stand fast were encircled where they stood. The psychological impact was immediate. German troops realized that this was not a temporary setback. Messages from neighboring units ceased. Rear areas were no longer safe. Roads once used for supply now carried refugees and retreating fragments of units. Discipline held in many cases, but purpose did not. Soldiers fought locally while the larger framework dissolved around them. Within days, the scale of the disaster became undeniable. Entire armies within Army Group Center were no longer in contact. Maps at headquarters became obsolete faster than they could be updated. Orders issued in the morning were meaningless by evening. The front did not bend. It shattered into disconnected segments. What distinguished this opening phase from earlier Soviet offensives was finality. There was no lull, no regrouping, no opportunity for stabilization. Soviet forces maintained relentless pressure, exploiting success immediately and everywhere. Each breakthrough fed the next. Momentum was not accidental. It was planned. By the end of the first week, the outcome was already decided. German forces were still fighting, still inflicting losses, but the structural integrity of the front was gone. Army Group Center existed only as a name. Its constituent formations were isolated, encircled, retreating, or destroyed. The opening blow had achieved its purpose. The German Eastern Front had not been pushed back. It had been torn open. What followed would not be a battle for territory, but a process of elimination. Once the initial breakthroughs widened, the battle ceased to resemble a conventional frontline fight. It became a series of rapidly forming encirclements that stripped German forces of time, space, and options. The destruction of Army Group Center was no longer a possibility. It was a process already underway. The decisive factor was speed combined with depth. Soviet exploitation forces did not pause to consolidate gains in the traditional sense. They pushed forward to operational objectives, river crossings, road hubs, rail junctions, while infantry followed to reduce bypassed resistance. This created a widening gap between German frontline units and any semblance of a rear area. What had been support zones turned into contested ground almost overnight. Encirclements formed first at the corps level, then expanded to consume entire armies. German formations that attempted to pull back discovered that retreat routes had already been cut. Columns moving west encountered Soviet spearheads or came under sustained artillery and air attack. Attempts to break out were disorganized and costly. Fuel shortages meant armored vehicles were often abandoned. Artillery was destroyed or left behind. Heavy equipment became dead weight in terrain that offered few alternatives. Command collapse accelerated physical collapse. As headquarters were overrun or forced to move repeatedly, coordination disintegrated. Subordinate units acted on outdated orders or none at all. Some attempted to fight their way west independently. Others obeyed standing orders to hold positions that no longer had strategic value. These decisions were not the result of incompetence at the unit level. They were the inevitable outcome of a system that could no longer process events fast enough to respond coherently. German doctrine emphasized counterattacks to seal penetrations. In theory, this required mobile reserves and reliable communications. In reality, neither existed. The few armored units available were either too far away, immobilized by fuel shortages, or already engaged elsewhere. Counterattacks that did occur were local and short-lived. They inflicted losses, but changed nothing. Soviet momentum absorbed them and moved on. The geography of Belarus intensified the disaster. Forests and marshes funneled movement into narrow corridors. Once these corridors were controlled or interdicted, maneuver became impossible. Units trapped off-road found themselves bogged down, exposed, and vulnerable. The same terrain that had once slowed Soviet advances now trapped German withdrawals. Logistics collapsed almost entirely. Supply depots were overrun or destroyed. Ammunition shortages became acute. Wounded soldiers could not be evacuated in large numbers. Medical services disintegrated under the scale of the retreat. Units that still had cohesion lacked the means to sustain combat. Hunger, exhaustion, and confusion spread rapidly. The human scale of the collapse was stark. Columns of German soldiers moved west without clear destinations, merging fragments of multiple units into improvised groups. Officers attempted to restore order, often successfully at the local level, but without higher coordination, their efforts could only delay the inevitable. Discipline did not fail. Structure did. Soviet forces exploited this relentlessly. They did not become fixated on destroying each pocket immediately. Encircled units were isolated, contained, and reduced when convenient. The priority remained forward momentum. This approach maximized the rate of German destruction while minimizing Soviet delay. It was a cold calculation, and it worked. One of the most damaging outcomes was the loss of experienced personnel. Officers, non-commissioned officers, and specialists were killed or captured in enormous numbers. These were not replaceable assets. Training pipelines could not compensate for their loss. Even units that eventually escaped encirclement emerged shattered in leadership and effectiveness. Within days, Army Group Center ceased to exist as an operational entity. Its armies were destroyed, captured, or fragmented beyond recovery. Maps at German headquarters still showed formations that no longer existed. Orders referenced units that could not respond. The name remained, but the substance was gone. Attempts to establish new defensive lines failed repeatedly. Soviet forces reached rivers and crossings faster than German engineers could prepare demolitions or defenses. Each attempted stand bought hours, not days. The concept of a continuous front dissolved into isolated strongpoints that were bypassed or crushed. The collapse had cascading effects beyond the immediate area. With the center gone, the flanks of the Eastern Front were exposed. Northern and southern German formations now faced the prospect of encirclement from new directions. Supply routes that supported multiple fronts were severed. Strategic coherence vanished. By the time German command acknowledged the scale of the disaster, there were no corrective measures left to take. Reinforcements did not exist. Reserves were committed elsewhere or already lost. Air power could not compensate. Orders to withdraw came too late and too slowly. The war in the East had entered a new phase, one defined by continuous retreat and irreversible loss. The encirclement phase of the offensive did not merely defeat German units. It erased the framework that allowed those units to function together. Army Group Center did not retreat. It disintegrated. What followed was not a reorganization, but a void. The German Eastern Front had lost its center of gravity. From that moment onward, everything to the north and south would unravel under pressure. The destruction was not dramatic in a single instant. It was comprehensive, systematic, and final. By the time German command began to understand the magnitude of what was happening, the window for recovery had already closed. This was not a matter of issuing better orders or moving units more efficiently. The destruction unleashed by Operation Bagration had crossed a threshold beyond which traditional remedies no longer worked. Army Group Center could not be stabilized, rebuilt, or meaningfully reconstituted, not because of panic or incompetence, but because the conditions required for recovery no longer existed. The first and most decisive barrier was the loss of operational depth. In earlier crises, Germany had been able to trade space for time, withdrawing units to secondary lines while reserves were assembled and supply routes reorganized. In the summer of 1944, there was no depth left to trade. Successive defensive lines had either not been prepared or were reached by Soviet forces before German units could occupy them. Every attempted fallback position became another point of collapse rather than a new anchor. Manpower losses made recovery structurally impossible. Entire divisions were wiped out or captured. Others were reduced to fractions of their authorized strength. Crucially, these losses were not evenly distributed. The heaviest casualties fell on experienced formations and leadership cadres, officers, non-commissioned officers, staff specialists, whose absence could not be offset by hastily assembled replacements. Even units that escaped encirclement often emerged as hollow shells, lacking the leadership required to function effectively. Material losses compounded this problem. Tanks, artillery, transport vehicles, and communications equipment were destroyed or abandoned in vast quantities. Unlike earlier in the war, Germany could not replace these losses in time or at scale. Industrial output was under relentless air attack. Fuel shortages limited mobility even for surviving units. An army without equipment is not an army. It is an armed crowd. Army Group Center was reduced to fragments that could fight briefly but not maneuver or sustain operations. Logistics collapsed beyond repair. Supply depots feeding the central sector were overrun or rendered inaccessible. Rail lines were cut repeatedly. Roads were cratered or controlled by Soviet forces. Even where supplies existed, there was no reliable means to distribute them. Ammunition shortages became chronic. Fuel was rationed to the point of paralysis. Medical evacuation systems disintegrated, increasing mortality and further degrading morale and cohesion. Command and control failures sealed the outcome. Headquarters were destroyed, displaced, or overwhelmed. Communications infrastructure was shattered. Orders could not be transmitted reliably, and when they were, the situation on the ground had already changed. Attempts to re-establish centralized control lagged behind events by days, not hours. In a fast-moving operational collapse, this delay was fatal. Hitler's command style worsened the situation. Standing orders emphasized holding ground and forbade withdrawals without explicit approval. In a context where rapid disengagement might have preserved combat power, these orders instead fixed units in place until they were surrounded. By the time permission to withdraw was granted, escape routes were gone. What might have been a costly retreat became total destruction. The absence of reserves was decisive. Germany had none. Every available mobile unit was already committed elsewhere or destroyed. The Eastern Front in mid-1944 had become a zero-sum environment. Any reinforcement sent to one sector weakened another. There was no strategic flexibility left. Bagration exploited this perfectly by striking the sector Germany could least afford to lose while it was distracted on other fronts. Psychological factors mattered, but they were secondary. German soldiers continued to fight with discipline and determination in many areas. Morale did not collapse overnight. What collapsed was belief in a coherent mission. Soldiers could see that they were no longer part of an organized front. Fighting became local, defensive, and increasingly disconnected from any larger purpose. That erosion of meaning accelerated disintegration even where cohesion remained temporarily intact. Attempts to form new defensive lines failed repeatedly because Soviet forces maintained pressure without pause. There was no operational breathing space. Each attempted regrouping was overtaken by Soviet advances. Bridges were seized before demolition. River lines were crossed before defenses were organized. German units arrived at positions only to find themselves already outflanked. The wider strategic context made recovery unthinkable. Germany was now fighting a multi-front war under conditions of material inferiority everywhere. The Western Allies had landed in France. Strategic bombing intensified. Resources that might once have been diverted east were urgently needed elsewhere, and still insufficient. Even if Army Group Center could somehow be rebuilt, it would have faced renewed pressure without respite. The loss of Army Group Center also had cascading effects. With the central sector gone, adjacent fronts were destabilized automatically. Northern formations risked isolation. Southern sectors lost secure supply routes. The entire Eastern Front became structurally unbalanced. Every subsequent German withdrawal was shaped by this initial rupture. There was no return to equilibrium. In practical terms, recovery would have required time, resources, leadership, and strategic freedom. Germany had none of these. Time favored the Soviets. Resources favored the Soviets. Leadership cadres were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Strategic freedom had been surrendered by years of overextension and rigid command. What makes this collapse distinct is not that Germany lost a battle. It is that Germany lost the ability to recover from defeat. After Bagration, every setback compounded the previous one. The war in the East became a continuous process of erosion rather than a sequence of discrete engagements. Army Group Center was not rebuilt because it could not be rebuilt. The conditions that once allowed Germany to absorb losses no longer existed. The offensive did not just defeat an army group. It destroyed the mechanisms that made armies recoverable. By the time the scale of the disaster was fully acknowledged, the question was no longer how to stop the Soviet advance. It was how long Germany could delay the inevitable. The destruction of Army Group Center marked a point of no return in the war on the Eastern Front. After Operation Bagration, Germany did not merely lose territory. It lost the structural ability to wage a coherent war against the Soviet Union. Everything that followed, retreats, defensive battles, and final collapse, flowed directly from this moment. The immediate consequence was strategic vacuum. With the center of the front gone, the German Eastern Front lost its anchor. Northern formations defending the Baltic states were suddenly exposed to encirclement from the south. Southern formations faced supply routes that no longer ran securely through Belarus. What had once been a continuous front became a series of disconnected sectors fighting separate battles for survival. This forced Germany into a permanent reactive posture. After Bagration, German operations were no longer planned offensives or deliberate defenses. They were emergency responses. Each move was dictated by Soviet action. Command initiative passed entirely to the Red Army. Germany could still influence tactics locally, but it could no longer shape campaigns. The loss of manpower was decisive in a way numbers alone do not capture. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. More important was who was lost. Army Group Center contained a disproportionate share of experienced officers and non-commissioned officers, men who had survived years of combat and held units together under pressure. Their destruction hollowed out the German army across all fronts. Replacement formations could be raised, but leadership competence could not be recreated at the same rate. Equipment losses compounded this leadership vacuum. Artillery, vehicles, radios, bridging equipment, and transport assets were destroyed in enormous quantities. These were not easily substitutable items. Without them, even surviving units lost operational relevance. Infantry without artillery and mobility could delay an enemy. It could not stop one. The psychological effect on German command was profound. Bagration shattered any remaining belief that the Eastern Front could be stabilized through incremental adjustments. The illusion that one more line or one more reserve could restore balance vanished. From this point forward, German planning revolved around delay rather than recovery. Every decision was made under the assumption that defeat was coming. The only question was when and where. For the Soviet Union, the consequences were equally significant, but opposite in direction. Bagration validated a mature operational doctrine built on coordination, depth, deception, and tempo. It confirmed that the Red Army could not only defeat German forces tactically, but dismantle them systemically. This confidence shaped subsequent operations all the way to Berlin. The Red Army no longer asked whether it could break German defenses. It asked how quickly. The offensive also altered the global strategic picture. Germany's allies took note. Confidence in German leadership eroded further. Resources and political support weakened. On the Allied side, Bagration demonstrated that the Soviet Union was capable of destroying entire German army groups independently. This reinforced the understanding that Germany was now fighting a losing war on all fronts simultaneously. From a military history perspective, Bagration stands apart from more famous battles because of its completeness. It did not hinge on a single city, river, or dramatic last stand. It was not defined by symbolic moments. It was defined by systemic collapse. An army group did not retreat, surrender, or reorganize. It ceased to exist as an effective force. After June 1944, Germany never again fielded a comparable formation on the Eastern Front. Subsequent defenses were improvised, thin, and increasingly brittle. Each retreat shortened Germany's strategic depth and increased Soviet leverage. What Bagration destroyed was not just manpower and equipment, but time, and once time was lost, it could never be regained. The road from Bagration to Berlin was not straight, but it was inevitable. Every major Soviet advance afterward exploited the same conditions created in Belarus: German lack of reserves, fractured command, and logistical fragility. The final battles of the war were fought by an army already defeated in structure months earlier. This is why Operation Bagration matters. Not because it was fast, though it was. Not because it was large, though it was immense. It matters because it ended the war in the East, in practical terms, long before the final shots were fired. Germany continued to fight, but it no longer possessed the means to change the outcome. In 10 days, an entire front vanished. In the months that followed, the consequences spread across Europe. Bagration was not the end of the war. It was the moment the war became unwinnable. If you want fact-heavy, system-level breakdowns of battles that didn't just defeat armies, but destroyed their ability to recover, subscribe to WW2 Battles. Next, the battle, weapon, or decision that pushed collapse even further.